All right, so here we are, chapter 15. This is Cultural Transformations, focusing specifically on religion and science from 1450 to 1750. So you'll notice that we are going to move forward in time as we go along, but sometimes we're talking about the same time period 2 weeks in a row. We're just focusing on a different theme for that time period. And so that's what we're doing here. So talking about specifically here religion and science 1450 to 1750, this is going to include things like the Protestant Reformation and the Enlightenment. So this quote here, we couldn't just throw up our hands and see these churches turned into nightclubs or mosques. So this is a quote from a church leader in the African country of Nigeria, and he's referring to a movement to try to bring African Christianity back to its roots. And this is going to be a reflection of something that had happened hundreds of years ago, the transmission of Christianity into Africa. So today, Christians from Africa will conduct missionary work in Europe and North Africa, and this is actually a reversal of an earlier pattern where it would have been the opposite. You would have had missionaries coming from Europe to work, and then later on from North America to work in Africa. So it's a flip-flop there. Christianity is going to, in this time period, become a genuine world religion. Of course, its remarkable rise throughout the Roman era to become at what was then a world religion is pretty astounding. But in this time period, it's actually going to become a world religion because, of course, at the time there was no knowledge of North and South America. So this is where it's truly going to become a global religion. It's going to help to connect distant peoples, whereas at the same time, the scientific revolution is going to foster a different approach to the world. It's not necessarily going to be opposed to Christianity, as we'll see. Almost all of the major scientific and other enlightened figures, they would have been Christians themselves. They never renounced Christianity, but it is going to foster a different way of looking at the world. So the Europeans were central players in these developments, but they did not act alone. The people who converted to Christianity, whether it be in North or South America, native groups there, or people in Asia or people in Africa, they themselves are going to shape Christianity, and in many times use a syncretic approach where they're going to blend their local and their native religion and cultural practices with Christianity. Science is also going to meet with various receptions in other regions of the globe, as we'll see as we explore the. So in 1500, so again starting about 1450 to 1500. By 1500, Christianity was mostly limited to the area from the Iberian Peninsula, so that's Spain and Portugal, and the British Isles in the west, and Russia to the east. There were small communities elsewhere outside of Europe in places like Egypt. Ethiopia would be probably the biggest one. It was a Christian country in Africa for a long, long time. Southern India and also Central Asia. Where Christianity existed, there were serious divisions. Initially, it's between the Roman Catholic religion of mainly Western Europe and Eastern Orthodox religion of Eastern Europe and Russia. By 1500, Christianity of Europe and of both Western and Eastern Europe is going to be on the defensive against Islam. They had lost the Holy Land by 1300, so the Crusades in the end had been in vain. They lost possession of the Holy Land to the Muslims. We recall that Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453, and this was a huge blow to Christianity, because Constantinople, if you recall if you took a Western Civ or a world history class that talked about earlier history, and you talked about the Roman Empire, you'll recall that for a while the Roman Empire was divided between the West and the East, and Constantinople was the capital of the Roman Empire in the East, and the Byzantine, what will become the Byzantine Empire. And so when it slowly dissolved in the west, it continued on in the east. And so Constantinople is kind of that last remnant of the Roman Empire in that way. It's very symbolic, and so its loss to the Ottomans was huge. And additionally, the Ottoman siege of Vienna in 1529 and then again in 1683, though not successful, was again very frightening to the Christian Europe. Okay, so we recall that Christianity is divided between the Roman Catholic Church in mainly Western Europe and the Orthodox Church in Eastern Europe and Russia. The western part is then going to be further fragmented with the very famous Protestant Reformation, which began in 1517. We date it from the time that Martin Luther posted his famous 95 Theses asking for a debate about ecclesiastical abuses. So that means, ecclesiastical means priestly abuses. Luther was not the only critics of the Roman Church. Luther himself was a Catholic priest because, of course, there was no Protestantism prior to Luther. Other people, both within the church itself and outside of it in the secular world, had criticized the Roman Church, mainly in terms of church abuses. The selling of indulgences was a big one for Luther, so that would be where the Catholic Church would ask for a donation from a wealthy individual, and in return they would ensure a spot for them in heaven. And so Luther very much opposed this as, an example of wealthy people buying their way into heaven. But his protest also was deeply grounded in theological differences. He especially questioned the role of clerical hierarchy, including the Pope, claiming that St. Peter was not to be the leader because, of course, the Pope is seen as the successor of St. Peter. He claimed that St. Peter was never pointed out by Jesus to be a leader in the church, and therefore there shouldn't be a pope. And of course, he also got rid of most of the sacraments of the Catholic Church besides a few. So Luther's ideas provoked a massive schism in Catholic Christendom. And it really wasn't just about religious differences, though that many people really felt that Luther's criticisms were just and they agreed with his theological differences. But it was also a political and economic motivation for many as well. A lot of monarchs used Luther to justify their independence from the papacy. Probably the most famous example of this would be King Henry VIII of England, who actually came out against Luther when Luther first started preaching his message. Henry VIII was very opposed to it. In fact, he wrote a treatise called In Defense of the Seven Sacraments, in which he said, his ideas are not biblically sound. But when the Pope refused to grant him a divorce from his first wife after she failed to give him a son, and his argument was, well, she was briefly married to my brother, and that's against church law. And when the Pope dithered on this for a while, he decided to use Luther and Protestantism to justify breaking away from the Catholic Church and to create the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. So you can see he's not really motivated there by theological principles. And in fact, the Anglican Church is very similar to Catholicism, theologically speaking, especially at the time of Henry VIII. He really didn't change a whole lot. He used it for political reasons, because for political reasons, the Pope wouldn't give him a divorce. His first wife was very well connected, being the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. And so he needed that. He needed to break away from the Pope. He didn't need to, but he wanted to break away from the Pope for political reasons. It also gave a new religious legitimacy to the middle class. A lot of commoners were attracted to the new religious ideas as a tool for protest against the whole social order. Oftentimes, advancement in the church, and the Catholic Church, was based off of your social hierarchy. And so this is an opportunity for commoners to see a new way forward in attacking the very aristocracy itself. And here we have an image of Luther nailing his 95 Theses to the church wall, which would have been a common way to post arguments or news at the time. And so that is what he's doing. He is dressed as a Catholic monk because that is what he was. Many women were also attracted to Protestantism, but the Reformation didn't really give them a greater role in church or society. In fact, Martin Luther had some pretty horrible things to say about women. If you want to look up what he had to say about women, you feel free to do so on your own. But he wasn't exactly progressive in terms of his feminist, we might call it feminist thought nowadays. They wouldn't have called it back then, of course. But he certainly wasn't forward thinking when it came to his views on women. And so women who wanted to assert their greater authority in this new Reformed Church of Lutheranism, and also the other Protestant sects that came up as a result of that, it didn't happen. Protestants also ended the veneration of Mary and other female saints, which greatly elevated the role of women. And also a big one, Protestants closed convents. And convents at the time were a way for women to have an alternative to marriage, which sounds strange to modern ears, but again, you have to put yourself in the time period we're talking about. If you were even a well-off woman, you didn't marry for affectionate reasons. Marriage wasn't about finding love. Marriage was most often an economic endeavor. Even if you weren't wealthy, if you were middle class and it made sense for your family to have him marry you off to the adjoining farmer and his lands, then you would do it. And your affection was not expected to be involved. And so for many women, it wasn't exactly an exciting prospect. You also have to take into account the fact that most women died in childbirth, and with no effective form of birth control, then you would be expected to have children as often as has happened. And for women at the time, because medical advances were so limited, the likelihood that they would die in childbirth was very great. And so it was scary for a lot of women. It was not the exciting prospect that it would be today. And also, you couldn't pursue anything else you were interested in. You couldn't pursue professionalism in any means. And so for some women who were very interested in, say, medicine or science or theology, entering a convent was a way for them to pursue those interests in a way that they wouldn't have been able to had they been married. And so closing the convents took away that option for women who were looking for something different. Really, it's only the Quaker Church. So the Quaker is one of the many Protestant sects that comes up after Luther and his 95 Theses. There's Lutheranism, Calvinism. Quakerism is another one. Quakers believed their most defining feature is that they strongly believed in the equality of everybody, including women. And so they had an official role in their churches. And Quakers actually, in American history, are one of the biggest aides in the Underground Railroad because they strongly believed in equality. They did not believe in slavery. And so they were very, very big participants in the Underground Railroad because of that. But there was some increase in the education of women simply because Protestantism emphasized Bible reading. This was something at the time that the Catholic Church did not allow. The Bible was written in Latin. Most people didn't speak or read Latin. But, of course, one of Luther's changes was that he wanted the Bible to be printed in the vernacular of whatever region you were living in. And he emphasized reading the Bible as a means of gaining personal salvation. That's a big emphasis of the of Luther and the Protestant Reformation, was that you don't need the hierarchy of the church. You don't need the intercession of priests. You can gain salvation through your own reading of the Bible, your own study of the Bible. So, of course, if you're going to gain that salvation for yourself, you have to be able to read the Bible. And so because of that, at least there's going to be an emphasis on being able to read and sometimes write. But really, for women, there would be little opportunity for them to use it in their day-to-day lives as wives and mothers. Again, just because you're a stay-at-home mom doesn't mean you don't have the opportunity to pursue intellectual pursuits. For example, I'm mostly a stay-at-home mom. I do this on the side, but that's not something that you would have had the time for in the time period we're talking about. Your time would be, for the average woman, completely taken up with daily tasks of taking care of a house. You didn't have any of the labor-saving devices that we have nowadays that, literally taking care of the house and cooking would have taken up your entire day. So you didn't have time for this. The Protestant Reformation happened when it did because of the printing press. As I said before, there had been other critics of certain aspects of the Catholic Church before, and it never went as far as Luther and his critiques. And that's because the printing press had been recently invented. Because of that, his 95 Theses could be copied and distributed fairly easily, not as easily as today, but at the time very easily, and spread throughout the world. And as the Reformation spread, it splintered into an array of competing Protestant churches. As I said before, you have Lutheranism, then you're going to have Calvinism, Quakerism, etc. And it'll go on from there. We won't get into the specifics about each and every one of them. Again, that would be something that you would get into at a higher level of history. We're just giving you a broad view of what's going on here. So, religious differences made Europe's fractured political system even more volatile. Europe is not, in terms of landmass, not that big compared to some of the other regions we're talking about, and yet it's splintered into all these different competing kingdoms. If you look at the map prior to this and you look at all the different kingdoms within Europe, it's pretty fractured politically. And sometimes within countries themselves, there are going to be wars of religion. So for instance, from 1562 to 1598, there were French wars of religion, Catholics versus the Huguenots. Huguenots are French Protestants. And you also have the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648. The Protestant Reformation also provoked a Catholic Counter-Reformation. At the Council of Trent, which was a meeting of Catholic clergy, they clarified Catholic doctrines and practices. They also corrected a lot of the abuses and the corruption that the Protestants had protested, like the sale of indulgences, for example. They placed a new emphasis on education and the supervision of priests to try to ensure that all priests were living up to the moral standard that was expected of them. There was a new crackdown on dissidents. So dissidents within the Catholic Church would not be tolerated. New attention was given to individual spirituality and piety. Remember, prior to this, it had been very much about the priest intercedes with you on everything. There's not a whole lot of personal study involved in the way that there is in Catholicism today. So that was something that was newly emphasized as a result of the Council of Trent. Also, there was a new religious order that was put in place. If you're not familiar with Catholicism, there are different religious orders, it's not like different kinds of Catholicism. It's just like priests and sisters might join different orders, like the Franciscans or the Augustinians. And they all emphasize, the Dominicans are another one, they all emphasize different things. And the Jesuits are going to be initially committed to renewal and expansion. The Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits, were to be the soldiers of Christ, to really go out there and to spread Catholicism and to crack down on Protestantism. Nowadays, they are very much committed to education. A lot of colleges are Jesuit colleges. My alma mater for my undergraduate, Loyola, is a Jesuit college named after Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuit order. The Reformation also is going to encourage skepticism towards authority and tradition. And this is something that's going to roll into the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution that we're going to talk about in a second here. It fostered religious individualism. Again, the idea of independent thinking, and this is going to lead to a lot of skepticism about conservative religion and about, other things in life, especially politically. And so that's going to be very important to remember and later on when we talk about different political revolutions, including the American Revolution, this idea of independent thought, independent determination is something that's really going to play into the establishment of democratic nations. So Christianity was motivated from and benefited from European expansion. This is the age of expansion as European countries are establishing colonies in North and South America and eventually in other parts of the world. The Spanish and the Portuguese saw overseas expansion as a continuation of the crusading tradition. And so because of that, they're going to combine religious and material interests, not necessarily about gaining money. It's also about spreading the Christian. And because of this, the globalization of Christianity does become possible. Settlers and traders bring their new religion with them. A lot of missionaries, very active among the Catholic community, are going to actively spread Christianity, but Protestants as well. Missionaries were most successful in Spanish America and the Philippines, and we talked about the Philippines last time. This is largely due to the overwhelming European presence in this area and the absence of a prior literate world religion, meaning there's no, in this area, there's no overarching religion to really compete with it. It's very much broken up based on the different communities that you'd be coming into contact with. And it's not literate, meaning there's no written tradition to it. It's an oral tradition. Okay, so focusing first on conversion and adaptation in Spanish America. So we talked before about the process of population collapse and conquest. Native American groups were largely, in some places, entirely decimated, but in most cases, the population dwindled significantly, and we talked about that before, the diseases, etc. And this made Native Americans more receptive to the conquering religion. And by 1700, most had been baptized and identified as Christian in the Spanish colonies. It's different in the British colonies or the French colonies, but in the Spanish colonies by 1700, most Native groups identified as Christian. As a result, the religious role of women had changed. For women, convents in the Spanish colonies were only for Spanish women and not for Native women. Europeans also claimed exclusive religious truth. They tried to destroy traditional religions instead of accommodating them, and this made some things different because occasional campaigns of destruction against old religions sometimes backfired and led to some overt resistance. Generally speaking, however, the blending of two religious traditions was more common. Just blending different types of Christianity with local traditions. So it's very successful in Spanish, in the Spanish colonies in Central America and in South America. To compare, in terms of efforts to make mass conversions in Asia, specifically in China, the Jesuits made a pretty big push to win over converts in China. It does reach China in the powerful, prosperous Ming Dynasty and the Qing dynasties as well. But there was a different missionary strategy needed. They needed government permission for operation. Remember, at this time, that the Chinese government is very sophisticated. It has an advanced bureaucracy. It controls a lot of different aspects of people's lives. And so they're not able to just come in and start preaching their message. They need permission from the Chinese government in order to do that. And the Jesuits in China really became targeted by the official Chinese as being subversive. So there really was no mass conversion in China because of this. However, the Jesuits were appreciated for other reasons. They spread scientific, geographic, technological, and cartographical skills, so mapping skills. They were, again, the Jesuits to this day have a large focus on education, so they were respected because of that. And they did win some converts in terms of some scholars and officials, but their efforts only gained 200,000 to 300,000 converts over 250 years, so not the significant success that they had in the Spanish colonies of the Americas. The missionaries didn't really offer much that the Chinese needed or wanted. Christianity was an all-or-nothing religion that would call for the rejection of too much of Chinese culture itself. Early in the 18th century, the papacy and other missionary orders opposed any kind of accommodation policy, and you're going to read more about the pluses and minuses of syncretism for your discussion question this week. So Things like respecting Chinese culture, pointing out parallels between different religions. This was something that the Jesuits wanted to do, but that got rejected by church authorities at the time. And so a lot of missionaries were expelled, or they lost favor at court because they were unable to do that. A lot of people within the Catholic Church didn't like this approach. And so because of that, they were really viewed with suspicion on both sides. Okay, so we know from our previous lectures, we know about the horrors of the slave trade, the mass diaspora of Africans out of Africa, mainly Western Africa, and to the New World. As they come to the New World, and even within Africa itself, there is going to be a blending of African forms of faith and religious and Christian forms of faith. So the development of Africanized form of Christianity in the Americas is seen in a lot of different ways. The incorporation of things like divination, dream interpretation, visions, spirit possession. These are elements of local native African religions that are getting incorporated into Christianity in the slave population of North and South America. Europeans did try to suppress these African elements of Christianity. They tried to denounce them as sorcery, witchcraft, devil worship, but a lot of them have persisted even to today. Probably the most popular would be voodoo or Santeria. These are still around to this day. They feature drumming, ritual dancing, sometimes animal sacrifice or spirit possession. And so these, again, are elements of native African faith that have been blended with Christianity. Okay, switching gears here to talk about what's going on as Christianity is spreading, what's going on in the Islamic world. Well, there is also a period of expansion and renewal in the Islamic world as well. There is going to be the continued spread of Islam. At this time, it's going to depend not necessarily on conquest, but on these wandering holy men, scholars, and also traders. They offered Arabic literacy, so similar to Protestantism. In order to be a Muslim, you have to be able to read the Quran, and so you have to be literate. And in order to do that, they often established schools, which was appealing to many people. They served as advisors and healers. They intermarried with locals, and they did not insist that locals give up their existing practices. Now, this will come into conflict with some more mainstream parts of the Islamic tradition, as we'll see. The islands of Southeast Asia also reveal a diversity of belief and practice. The syncretism of Islamization was, as I mentioned before, increasingly offensive to very strongly Orthodox Muslims. And this helped to provoke movements of religious renewal in the 18th century. So there was a series of jihads in West Africa. Jihad means a holy war in the 18th and early 19th century that tried to root out these unorthodox Muslim practices as they saw them, where they were afraid of this syncretism between native faiths and Islam, and they wanted to root that out and to establish a more quote-unquote pure Islam in Southeast and Central Asia, and in places where syncretism was more common, places like North Africa and Southeast. The most well-known movement of Islamic, trying to become a more pure Islamic territory would be Wahhabi Islam. This developed in the Arabian Peninsula in the mid-18th century. So if you look at the map to your right there, the orange part would be the core Wahhabi territory. Its founder, Abd al-Wahhab, was a theologian, and he aimed to restore absolute monotheism and end the veneration of saints, as was popular in some of these outlying regions of Islam. This movement started off largely as a theological movement, but it became a political movement when it led to the creation of a state that was supposedly a purified state. They emphasized women's rights within the patriarchal framework in this state, and the local power of the Wahhabis was broken in 1818, but the movement remained influential in the Islamic world. Okay, talking about religion in China. The Chinese and the Indian cultural religious change wasn't as dramatic as what occurred in Europe or Arabia. Confucianism and Hindu cultures didn't spread as widely in the early modern period. It should be said, Confucianism is not a religion. It is a way of life. It is a way of, it's more of a philosophy. So it's not a practice of worship in the way that Hinduism is. But still, they do remain popular in China and in India, respectively, but neither remain static. They do change. So China is still operating within a Confucian framework at this time. They do have the addition of Buddhist and Taoist thought. Buddhism, of course, is a religion. Taoism is not. Taoism is another philosophy. But both dynasties at this time embraced the Confucian traditions. And again, it's a philosophy. It's a way of looking at the world and of carrying out your life, but not necessarily. There was going to be, however, a considerable amount of debate and new thinking in China. Confucianism was seen as the way to achieve a virtuous life, and also was the way to become, to better yourself in life. If you wanted to take that civil service exam, for instance, that was based on Confucianism. So that, again, would get you a job within the government bureaucracy. Chinese Buddhists also tried to make religion more accessible for commoners, saying that withdrawal from the world was not necessary for one to achieve enlightenment. So this is similar to Martin Luther's argument that individuals don't need help from a priestly hierarchy. So prior to this, in order to be a Buddhist and to achieve enlightenment, you had to be a Buddhist monk. You had to withdraw completely from the world. Now that's changing, and it's becoming more accessible to everybody who maybe can't withdraw from the world entirely. At the time, there's also going to be a lively popular culture that is even in China, that's even going to permeate among the less well-educated, the more common folk as well. Things like production of plays, paintings, literatures, novels, which are going to become increasingly popular in Europe, are also going to be popular in China at this time as well. In India, we still have a religious divide between Hindus and Muslims. There are going to be several movements, however, that are going to bring Hindus and Muslims together in new forms of religious expression. So remember, the Mughals are the ruling dynasty at the time of India. However, they were a Muslim dynasty. But the large majority of the population of India was Hindu. So the Mughal Empire, Akbar, sponsored an elite cultural fusion of religious traditions. He created a state cult that fused Islam, Hinduism, and Zoroastrianism, which is a form of religion that originated in Persia. He also adopted European Renaissance Christian paintings and illustrated a book of Hindu yoga poses as well. And so again, part of that blending. Also, the Bhakti movement is going to be very important in India as well. This is devotional Hinduism. And so this is a way for Hindus to achieve spiritual enlightenment, and it's focused on, again, devotion to a specific God. And their effort is to achieve a union with the divine through things like songs, prayers, dances, poetries, and rituals. And again, it's a very personal experience, and it appealed especially to women. However, it often became an avenue for social criticism because it often set aside caste differences and detailed rituals for personal religious experience. And it had much more common with Sufism to help blur the line between Islam and Hinduism in India. So speaking of Sikhism, you're going to see a growth of Sikhism in India as well. This is a religion that blended Islam and Hinduism. Its founder, Guru Nanak, had been part of the Bhakti movement, and he came to believe that Islam and Hinduism were not different faiths and were in fact one. And so he and his successors set aside the caste distinctions and proclaimed the essential equality of men and women. And this grew into an entirely new type of faith in India. And there is a depiction of him. Okay, back to Europe. Kind of made a big loop around the world here, and now we're going to talk about the scientific revolution. This was an intellectual and cultural transformation that occurred between the mid-16th century and the early 18th century. Its emphasis was on rational inquiry based on evidence, and the belief was this in turn led to knowledge. And the creators of this movement saw themselves as making a radical departure from the way most Europeans thought and viewed the world around them prior to this. The scientific revolution is vastly significant and is going to help lead to an arguably even more significant development. That's the Industrial Revolution. It fundamentally altered ideas about the place of humankind within the cosmos, the world around us. It challenged the teachings and authority of the church. It challenged ancient social hierarchies and political systems. It, however, was also used to legitimize racial and gender inequality. And this is something that you would look more into if you wanted to take the early American history class at Prairie State or any other college. You look into some of the leaders of the scientific revolution within the colonies and their discussions of how that plays into race. But just for our purposes, know that they use this, unfortunately, to try to say that certain races were inherently better than others and that men were inherently better than women. So it's not all a positive thing here. And by the 20th century, science had become the chief symbol of modernity around the world, though again, not always necessarily in a good way. So why did this originate in Europe? Similar to why did the age of exploration seem to take off in Europe and not anywhere else? The Islamic world was certainly the most scientifically advanced in the era, I should say, rather, prior to this, so 1800 to 1400. And at the same time, China's technological accomplishments and economic growth were unmatched for several centuries. So why did the scientific revolution and then the Industrial Revolution begin in Europe? Several reasons. European conditions were uniquely favorable to the rise of science as a study. There was the evolution in Europe of a legal system that guaranteed some independence for a variety of institutions by the 12th and 13th century. So, for instance, the idea of the corporation or a collective group that was treated as a legal unit with certain rights. The autonomy of emerging universities, these things are not controlled by the state. They're not controlled by the monarch. They are independent. That's going to be hugely significant. In the Islamic world, science remained mostly on the outside of systems of higher education. It wasn't something that was really studied in universities in the way it was in Europe. Also, Chinese authorities did not permit independent institutions of higher learning. Their higher education was focused on preparing for civil service exams, with an emphasis on classical Confucian texts, so not science. Pretty much the whole purpose is to try to get you to pass that exam so you can take your role in the Chinese bureaucracy. There's really no room for science. Also, Western Europe could draw on the knowledge of other cultures. Remember what we've just had. We've just had the Enlightenment. We've just had the Renaissance, where there's been a rediscovery of old Greek and Roman texts, and a lot of these deal with science, a rediscovery of some scientific knowledge that had been previously forgotten about. So, therefore, by the 16th and 18th centuries, Europeans were at the center of a massive new information change. This is a tidal wave of knowledge that is going to completely shake up old ways of thinking. This explosion of uncertainty and skepticism, some of which is the result of the Protestant Revolution, allowed modern science to emerge. So if we're just not accepting traditions anymore, if we've learned to be skeptical about certain things, then we are more likely to grasp on to modern science. Additionally, the Reformation contributed by challenging authority, again, not just accepting traditions anymore, encouraging mass literacy, and affirming secular professions. Although, as we'll see, many of these great thinkers of the scientific revolution were Christians themselves, professed Christians, sometimes even members of the clergy. So this is also going to be a cultural revolution as well. The dominant educated European view of the world before the scientific revolution is that the earth is stationary, it's at the center of the universe, and the universe is one of divine purpose. So the earth doesn't move. That was the view prior to the scientific revolution. The initial breakthrough and challenge to this is going to be by Nicholas Copernicus. He wrote a treatise called On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres, in which he promoted the view that the earth and the planets revolved around the sun, not the other way around, not that the earth was the center and everything else revolved around us. Other scientists built on Copernicus's insight. Johannes Kepler, for instance, demonstrated the elliptical orbits of the planets. So if you go back to the previous slide and you look at Copernicus's view, he has the idea that we orbit around the sun, right? But he has the planets going in perfect circles. And Kepler demonstrated that they're actually elliptical orbits and not circles. Galileo developed and improved the telescope and helped to record observations of the cosmos. Some of his discoveries are going to be challenged by the church, as you can see him on trial there in the painting to the right. Sir Isaac Newton was pretty much like the apex of the scientific revolution. What didn't he do? If you've taken a physics class, you know a lot about this. We're not going to go into the details because this is not a physics class. But in general, he formulated the laws of motion and mechanics. His central concept was this idea of universal gravitation and this idea that natural laws govern both the micro and the macrocosm. By the time of Newton's death, educated Europeans had a fundamentally different view of the physical universe. They no longer necessarily believed that it was propelled by angels and spirits, but functioned according to mathematical principles, like the principle of gravity. The idea of the machine of the universe was self-regulating, and the knowledge that the universe could be obtained through reason, through observation, through what will eventually become known as the scientific method. Also, the human body will become less mysterious through cadaver research. This was something that had been going on previously in the Renaissance, but during the scientific revolution, it's really going to take off, believe it or not. Prior to this, even going into the Greek and Roman world, the understanding of the body was based on not actually looking inside the human body. So if you ever look at like anatomical drawings prior to this, I mean, organs are in way the wrong spot. So they really didn't have a strong understanding of the human body, and medical practices at the time were frighteningly limited. Just be grateful that you live in the modern era in which we have much more understanding and insight into how the body works. The leaders of the scientific revolution were almost entirely male. Remember, one of the downsides of the scientific revolution is that it was often used to propagate the idea that men were inherently superior to women. But there were a few aristocratic women who participated informally in the scientific networks of male relatives. The Catholic Church strenuously opposed a lot of the thinking of the scientific revolution. Some leaders were burned. Galileo was forced to renounce his belief that the Earth moved around in orbit and rotated on its axis. But no early scientists rejected Christianity, and that's an important insight. And church officials did support some scientists. To be fair, Galileo was often undiplomatic in his dealings with the church. But, for example, church officials did support Copernicus and his research. So, science and the Enlightenment. The scientific revolution is going to gradually reach a wider European audience outside of academia. The scientific approach to knowledge is going to be applied to other things, other parts of the world, other parts of study, not just science. For example, Adam Smith, the founder of capitalism, used the scientific approach to formulate economic laws that, again, would would lead to the development of the capitalist economic system. Additionally, people believed that scientific development would help to bring enlightenment to humankind, enlightenment being a better way of looking at the world around us and a way of creating a better society, not just in terms of science, but politically, economically, socially as well. All right, what is enlightenment? Well, Immanuel Kant, who himself was an Enlightenment thinker, defined the Enlightenment as daring to know. European Enlightenment thinkers believed that knowledge, scientific way of viewing the world could transform human society. And again, not just in terms of science, but through all aspects of life. They tended to be pretty satirical. We'll talk about Voltaire in a second. He's probably the most satirical of them all. Critical, open-minded, and inquisitive, and also hostile to established authorities. And that's important to remember because the founding fathers of America were devotees, for lack of a better word, to the Enlightenment. And so that questioning of authority is going to be very important in certain parts of the world and important in establishing democratic societies. They attacked arbitrary government, the idea that the person in charge is king simply because he's the son of a previous king, the divine right of kings, the fact that the king can't be questioned, and also aristocratic privilege. Again, why simply for accident of birth are you the one who's in charge versus somebody who's maybe more suited to being in charge of government or the economy? And John Locke is probably the most famous for articulating these ideas into that of the idea of a constitutional government, which is hugely significant here in the United States. Much of Enlightenment also attacked established religion. In his treatise on toleration, Voltaire, who I just mentioned, attacked the narrow particularism of an organized religion. And many of the Enlightenment thinkers were deists, such as many of the founding fathers. This is the belief in a remote deity who created the world but doesn't intervene. The popular analogy that's used is God is the clockmaker or the watchmaker. He sets the world in motion and then steps back. So they don't they believe there's a God, but they don't believe that God intervenes in everyday life. Some were pantheists. They equated God with nature, and some even regarded religion as a fraud, though again, most Enlightenment or scientific leaders at this time were not agnostic or atheists as we would think of them. Here we have a painting of various philosophers of the Enlightenment discussing their ideas in a very civilized manner. The role of women in society and their education were also continual topics of debate at this time. And unfortunately, didn't lead to a whole lot of advancement for women. Enlightenment thought was also influenced by a growing global awareness. Also, central to the theme of the Enlightenment was the idea of progress. This is something that we have rejected in terms of history, but the idea used to be, well, as we go forward in time, we're getting better, right? Like we're progressing towards some sort of like better world. And that's, of course, what we hope for. But in the study of history, we've come to understand that that's not always the case. Again, we strive for it. At least I hope most people strive for it. I hope most world leaders are striving for it. But sometimes over time, some things get worse, some things get better, some things stay the same. But to the Enlightenment thinkers, they very much believed that we were moving towards some sort of a better world. Some other leaders, such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, argued for an immersion in nature rather than book learning. This is kind of a more romantic view of looking at things. This romantic movement appealed to the emotion and to the imagination instead of just kind of cold rationality. Religious awakenings are also going to become popular at this time. This is the time of the First Great Awakening in the United States, for instance. If you've taken a U.S. history class, that should ring a bell. And enlightened religions that fused faith and science, such as Quakers and also Unitarians as well. All right, European science beyond the West. So we talked about how religion spread. How does the science of the scientific revolution spread beyond Europe and European colonies? Well, science became the most widely desired product of European culture. We mentioned before that the Chinese had a selective interest in the Jesuits' teaching. They liked what they taught about science. Japan also kept up some European contact. Remember, Europeans had been banned from Japan. Japan was very much isolationist at the time. But starting in 1720, they did start to allow the import of some Western books. And a small group of Japanese scholars became interested in these Western books, particularly in anatomical studies. The Ottoman Empire chose not to translate major European scientific works, however. They were only interested in ideas of practical utility, like maps and calendars, versus things that weren't inherently practical. The Islamic educational system was also conservative, and it made it hard for theoretical science to really do well there. And so there's not this expansion of European science within the Ottoman Empire. All right. So looking ahead, science in the 19th century and beyond. Modern science was cumulative and also self-critical. Cumulative in looking at the accumulation of knowledge, and self-critical in the idea of trying to improve, again, the idea of progress. In the 19th century, science was applied to new sorts of inquiry, and in some ways it undermined different Enlightenment assumptions. So for instance, Charles Darwin argued that all life was in flux, the idea of evolution. Karl Marx presented human history as a process of change and struggle. Sigmund Freud is going to cast doubt on human rationality, which of course was the central tenet of Enlightenment. And also 20th century physics, such as relativity and quantum theory, questioned some of Newton's assumed constants that he came up with. Cultural borrowing was also involved along with the transformations of the modern era. It was almost always selective instead of wholesale. So, for instance, appropriating Christian ideas with Western knowledge. For instance, Chinese interest in map making over medicine. They're interested in some things and not others. Borrowing may often cause conflict as new ideas are brought in from other parts of the world. They're often seen as subversive. And also domesticating or borrowing ideas and practices that was done to try to ease tension. This also is going to cause some problems in and of itself. All right, your chapter question for today is going to focus on that syncretism. So read sources 15.1, 15.2, 15.3, and 15.4, both A and B, and answer the following question. From a missionary viewpoint, develop arguments for and against religious syncretism using these sources as a point of reference. So again, this is the idea of blending Christianity with local faiths and look at whether or not that's a good or a bad thing.